Elements and compounds are identified by characteristics like melting point, boiling point, solubility, and density. This experiment focuses on density, which is the mass of a substance per unit of volume, d equals m divided by v. If two of the three terms in the equation are known, the third can be found. In this experiment, we find the density of an unknown liquid and an unknown solid. To determine density, we have to measure the mass and volume of a given amount of material. The volume of a liquid can be determined directly by measuring with a graduated cylinder. The mass is determined indirectly by weighing the empty flask and then weighing it while filled. To determine volume, use V equals m divided by d. To find the density of the unknown liquid, use mass of flask and unknown minus mass of flask equals mass of unknown. Plug the volume and mass into d equals m divided by v to find the unknown density.
To complete this lab, you will need a balance, a thermometer, a stopper, a flask, zinc, soda, a wide-mouth funnel, water, and paper towels. Start by taking a 50 milliliter flask and record its weight with a stopper in it. Fill the flask completely with water and put the stopper back on to drive out air and any excess water. Be sure to wipe off any water remaining on the outside of the flask. Then record the weight of the stoppered flask with the water in it, and also take the temperature of the water. Empty and dry the flask, then fill it completely with the liquid, in this case the soda, and put the stopper back on. Dry the outside of the flask with a paper towel. Next, weigh the stoppered flask with the liquid in it. Rinse and dry the flask again and obtain the unknown solid, in this case the zinc. Be sure to be wearing gloves when touching the zinc. Using a wide-mouth funnel, fill the flask about halfway with the solid. Put the stopper back on the flask and record its weight. Fill the flask with water, insert the stopper, and dry off any excess water. Record its weight, then take the temperature of the water. To clean up, pour the water out into the sink and put the zinc on a paper towel in a weigh boat and leave out to dry. To calculate the mass of water required to fill the flask, subtract the mass of the empty stoppered flask from the mass of the stoppered flask filled with water. To find the volume of the water required to fill the flask, go online and find the density of water at the specific temperature recorded. Using this, along with the calculated mass of water required to fill the flask, plug these values into the density equation to get the calculated volume of the flask. To find the mass of the unknown liquid required to fill the flask, subtract the mass of the empty stoppered flask from the mass of the stoppered flask filled with the unknown liquid. Next, to determine the density of the unknown liquid, plug in the mass of the unknown liquid required to fill the flask for mass and the calculated volume of the flask for volume, and solve for density. In order to find the mass of the solid added to the flask, subtract the mass of the empty stoppered flask from the mass of the flask plus the solid. Next, to find the mass of the water added to the flask, subtract the mass of the flask plus the solid from the mass of the flask, solid, and water. To solve for the volume of water added to the flask, look up the density of water at the specific temperature recorded. Using this along with the mass of water added to the flask, plug the values into the density equation and solve for volume. To find the volume of the unknown solid, subtract the mass of water added to the flask from the mass of the water added that was required to fill the flask. Using this, plug the values into the density equation for volume along with the mass of the solid added to the flask for mass and solve to find the density of the unknown solid. Through the use of equations previously mentioned, we are able to calculate the density of an unknown solid and liquid. By knowing two of the three variables in the equation for density, you are able to solve for the third. Doing this, we found the density of soda to be 1.06 grams per milliliter and the density of zinc to be 4.98 grams per milliliter. In order to minimize error in this experiment, be sure to wipe off the outside of the flask before weighing it. If this is not done, then the mass recorded will be higher than it should have been, therefore causing the calculated density to be greater than it actually is. Also, be sure that when filling the flask with water, that there are no air bubbles present, or else this will cause the water to be recorded as a greater volume than it actually is, therefore making the density smaller than it should be.